A millionaire found a homeless woman and her twins and took them into his home to care for them. A few days later, the woman appeared on TV crying and saying, "The streets of San Diego shimmered under a veil of rain, a steady drizzle that softened the neon lights of storefronts and cast a watery glow over the city." Gregory Marlowe sat stiffly behind the wheel of his black sedan, the gentle hum of the engine barely cutting through his thoughts. It was late, and the city was quieter than usual, an unsettling stillness for a man who thrived in the constant noise of commerce and negotiation. He loosened his tie, the knot constricting as much as his thoughts. Tonight had been another late meeting, another round of polite exchanges, masking veiled threats. Susan would likely be asleep by now, the soft rustle of her breathing, the only welcome sound waiting in their sprawling two-empty house. The thought made him sigh, a quiet resignation to the life he had chosen. The GPS's polite monotone directed him to turn left, but Gregory hesitated. On impulse, he veered right, his car gliding onto a less familiar street. The neighborhood was a patchwork of narrow alleys and dimly lit shopfronts, a stark contrast to the sleek towers of downtown. He wouldn't typically visit this location, but tonight, its serene obscurity captivated him. The headlights sliced through the drizzle, catching movement on the sidewalk ahead. Gregory instinctively slowed the car, his eyes narrowing as the shapes became clearer. A woman sat, huddled against the base of a lamppost, her arms wrapped tightly around two small figures pressed into her side. The thin fabric of her coat clung to her like a second skin, drenching her. One of the children, a boy, no older than 2, clung to her neck, his face buried against her shoulder. The other, swaddled awkwardly in a tattered blanket, was barely visible. Gregory's foot hovered over the brake, the logical part of his mind warring with something deeper, older. He wasn't the kind of man who stopped for strangers. He measured his world in contracts and results, not in messy human connections. Yet the scene held him captive, an unspoken plea in the tilt of the woman's head as she turned slightly, her hollow eyes catching the light. He pulled over, the windshield wipers screeching faintly as they struggled against the rain. For a moment, he stayed in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Approaching a stranger on a deserted street at this hour wasn't just uncharacteristic, it was irrational. Yet his gaze kept returning to the small figures huddled against her. The boy's tiny hand clutched the fabric of her coat with a desperation that Gregory couldn't ignore. He stepped out, let the rain cool against his face, and crossed the street. His polished shoes splashed through shallow puddles, a jarring contrast to the sodden sneakers the boy wore. "Are you all right?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, the question sounding more like a demand. He cleared his throat, softening. "Do you need help?" The woman flinched, drawing the children closer. Her face, gaunt and pale, held a wary defiance. "We're fine," she said quickly, her voice low but firm. The words were rote, a rehearsed dismissal that barely hid her unease. "You don't look fine," Gregory replied, his gaze drifting to the children. The boy's face remained hidden, yet his small frame trembled visibly. The baby let out a weak cry, muffled by the damp blanket. "It's freezing. You can't stay out here." "I said, we're fine." Her tone hardened, but her eyes flickered, betraying the truth. Gregory hesitated, his mind scrambling for the right words. He wasn't good at this, the unpolished language of empathy. Logic, not instinct, built his world. Yet standing here, under the cold rain, with those hollow eyes staring back at him, he found logic slipping through his grasp. "I'm not asking for anything," he said finally, his voice quieter. "But those kids need somewhere warm. At least let me help with that." The woman's grip on the boy tightened. For a long moment she said nothing, the rain filling the space between them. Then slowly, her shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her. She nodded, barely perceptible. Gregory exhaled, relief mixing with a strange unease. He crouched slightly, keeping his movements deliberate, and extended his hand toward the boy. "Hey there," he said softly. "I'm Gregory. What's your name?" The boy peeked out cautiously, his face streaked with rain and grime. He didn't answer, but his wide, dark eyes met Gregory's with a mixture of fear and hope that hit harder than any negotiation ever had. "It's okay," Gregory said, his voice steady. "We'll get you inside." The woman rose slowly, her movements stiff and painful. She cradled the baby carefully, her hands trembling. Gregory stepped back to give her space, his mind already racing with questions. Who were they? How had they ended up here? But as he led them to his car, he pushed the questions aside. For now, it was enough that they were coming with him. The answers could wait. As the car door clicked shut behind them, Gregory glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman sat stiffly, her eyes darting between him and the street outside. The boy clung to her side, his tiny fingers gripping the fabric of her coat like a lifeline. The baby had quieted, lulled by the warmth of the car. Gregory adjusted the rearview mirror, catching his own reflection. For the first time in years, he felt like a man stepping into the unknown. The wrought-iron gates of the Marlowe estate swung open, their creak swallowed by the hush of the rain-soaked night. Gregory guided the car along the driveway, past manicured hedges and the soft glow of garden lamps. The mansion stood ahead, its stately facade imposing yet strangely comforting, a beacon of stability amidst the uncertainty now seated in his back seat. Inside the car, Catherine sat rigid, cradling the baby tightly. John clung to her side, his face buried against her arm, as though proximity alone could shield them from the unknown. Gregory parked the car beneath the porte-cochere, hesitating for a moment before stepping out. He had never brought strangers into his home before, and the weight of the decision pressed heavily on his chest. The front doors opened before he reached them, and Susan appeared in the doorway, her figure framed by warm light spilling from within. Her auburn hair was pulled back loosely, and she wore a knitted cardigan, its soft texture matching the concern in her eyes. "Gregory?" she asked, her gaze flickering past him to the figures emerging from the car. Her tone was a mixture of curiosity and gentle reproach, as though she couldn't quite reconcile the sight before her with the man she had married. "They needed help," Gregory said simply, stepping aside as Catherine approached, her hesitant steps faltering at the threshold. Susan's expression softened instantly. "Of course," she said, her voice warm and steady. "Come inside, all of you." Catherine hesitated, her eyes darting between Susan and Gregory, then back to the open doorway. The mansion's grandeur loomed before her, every polished marble tile and intricately carved banister, a stark contrast to the damp and crumpled state of her clothes. For a moment, she seemed ready to turn and bolt, but Susan stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "It's all right," Susan said gently. "You're safe here." The words, spoken with quiet conviction, seemed to break through Catherine's defenses. She nodded and stepped inside, pulling John with her. The boy's tiny hand gripped hers so tightly, his knuckles whitened. His wide eyes darted around the entryway, taking in the high ceilings and glittering chandelier, with a mixture of awe and unease. "Ben," Susan called, and the butler appeared almost instantly, his footsteps silent on the polished floors. Tall and composed, with a calm that bordered on unshakable, Ben's presence added an air of quiet assurance to the room. "Prepare the guest room," Susan instructed, "and bring some warm towels. They're soaked." Ben's sharp eyes flicked to Catherine and the children, taking in every detail. The damp strands of hair plastered to John's forehead, the threadbare blanket wrapped around the baby, the way Catherine's gaze never settled for long on anyone. He nodded curtly and disappeared down the hall. Susan crouched in front of John, her movements slow and deliberate. "Hi there," she said, her voice soft enough to draw him out without startling him. "I'm Susan. What's your name?" The boy tightened his grip on Catherine's coat, his lips pressed into a stubborn line. Catherine placed a protective hand on his head, smoothing his wet hair. "This is John," she said. "And this little one is Jack." "John," Susan repeated with a smile. "That's a strong name." She glanced at Jack, who whimpered softly in Catherine's arms. "Let's get you both dried off and warm, okay?" John didn't respond, but his shoulders relaxed slightly as Susan reached for the blanket wrapped around Jack. Catherine flinched, pulling the baby closer. "I've got him," she said quickly, her voice edged with a defensiveness that made Susan pause. "Of course," Susan replied, her tone unruffled. She rose gracefully, keeping her movements unthreatening. "Let's get you settled first." Ben returned with the towels, offering one silently to Catherine. She took it with a mumbled, "Thank you," her eyes darting to Gregory, as though expecting him to rescind his offer of refuge. Gregory caught her glance, but said nothing, his mind turning over the fragments of her presence that didn't quite fit. He pushed the thoughts aside, unwilling to interrogate a woman who clearly needed help. At least, not yet. As Ben led the way to the guest quarters, Susan lingered in the entryway with Gregory. Her hand brushed his lightly, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken tension that had entered their home. "What happened?" she asked, her voice low. "I found them on the street," Gregory replied. "They had nowhere else to go." Susan's eyes searched his face, her concern deepening. "And she didn't say why?" "Not much," Gregory admitted. "Just hardship." Susan's lips pressed into a thoughtful line. "Well, whatever it is, we'll figure it out. For now, they need rest." Upstairs, Catherine settled into the guest room, tucking John and Jack into the large bed. The boy lay stiffly beside his brother, his small frame dwarfed by the plush duvet. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders hunched as she stared at the floor. From the doorway, Ben watched silently, his sharp gaze flicking to the duffel bag she had clutched since arriving. "If you require anything else, Mrs.—" He trailed off, waiting. "Just Catherine," she said, not looking up. Ben inclined his head slightly. "Very well. Sleep well, Miss Catherine." As he left, he caught Gregory's eye in the hallway. "Something about her doesn't sit right," Ben murmured, his voice low. Gregory nodded, the unspoken suspicion settling deeper into his chest. In the quiet of their bedroom later, Susan placed a reassuring hand on Gregory's arm. "Whatever this is, we'll handle it together," she said softly. Gregory nodded, though his gaze lingered on the darkened hallway beyond. The night had brought Catherine and her children into their home, but it had also brought questions that would not be easily answered. The morning broke quietly over the Marlowe estate, a pale light filtering through the tall windows and dappling the grand staircase with a soft, golden hue. Susan's movements were brisk but deliberate as she navigated the kitchen, balancing a steaming pot of oatmeal and a tray of freshly cut fruit. "John likes the oatmeal plain," she noted aloud, as though the shy boy had confided in her. Though in truth, his wary glance toward the bowl last night had said as much. Jack babbled softly from a high chair nearby, his small hands clumsily patting the wooden tray. Susan smiled, her heart warmed by his innocence. But her attention lingered on the doorway, where Catherine had yet to appear. Gregory sipped his coffee at the breakfast table, his thoughts distant. He hadn't slept well, his mind circling Catherine's vague explanations. Every attempt to piece together her story revealed inconsistencies. Why had she been wandering the streets with two young children? Her claim of being evicted from a distant shelter felt thin, as if the truth had been hastily tucked behind a convenient half-lie. Susan's voice broke his reverie. "She hasn't come down yet," Gregory shook his head, setting his mug down. Ben checked on them earlier. She's still in the room. Susan glanced toward the stairs, concern crossing her face. Maybe she's just tired, she offered, though her tone carried a faint uncertainty. I'll bring her some tea. Before Gregory could respond, the shrill ring of his phone cut through the air. He reached for it, frowning as the name flashed on the screen. Patterson. He hesitated before answering, nodding towards Susan to continue. Gregory Marlowe, he said curtly. The voice on the other end was smooth, almost too casual. Gregory, my old friend, Zachary Patterson drawled. I trust you're keeping busy these days. Gregory's grip tightened on the phone. Patterson's faux camaraderie always felt like the prelude to a trap. If you've called to waste my time, Zachary. I don't have much of it. Patterson chuckled, a dry sound that only deepened Gregory's irritation. Ah, so direct. But I thought you might appreciate a heads up. There's chatter in certain circles, your recent setbacks, some vulnerabilities. I'd hate to see things unravel for you. Gregory snapped, despite his stomach twisting. Patterson's cryptic words carried weight, a deliberate barb aimed at unsettling him. Patterson responded, his tone filled with mock sincerity. Take care, Gregory. You never know who might be watching. The line went dead before Gregory could respond. He set the phone down with more force than intended, his jaw clenched. Patterson's subtle threats were nothing new, yet they consistently left a bitter aftertaste. Zachary again. Susan's voice came from the doorway, a tray of tea balanced in her hands. Gregory nodded. He's fishing for something, or laying the groundwork for a move. Susan frowned but said nothing. She placed the tea tray on the counter and approached him, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We'll handle it, she said softly. We always do. Gregory nodded, though his thoughts remained heavy. He could sense the brewing storm. Upstairs, Catherine sat on the edge of the guest bed, her gaze fixed on the duffel bag at her feet. The room's quiet elegance seemed to shrink around her, its warmth an uncomfortable reminder of her distance from this world. John played quietly on the floor, his small hands stacking wooden blocks that Ben had left the night before. Jack napped in the crib by the window, his breaths soft and rhythmic. A knock at the door startled her. Susan entered without waiting for a response, her movements unassuming but purposeful. Good morning, Susan greeted, setting the tea tray on a small table. Her eyes briefly swept the room, noting Catherine's tense posture and the untouched breakfast tray from earlier. I thought you might like something warm. Catherine offered a faint smile, though her shoulders remained stiff. Thank you. Susan took a seat near the crib, her gaze softening as she looked at Jack. He seems to be settling in well. Catherine hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her coat. He's a lovely baby, she said quietly. Always has been. Susan's expression didn't waver, though she caught the faintest waver in Catherine's voice. You're both doing remarkably well, she said, her voice kind but probing. It can't have been easy, keeping them safe. It wasn't, Catherine replied, her tone clipped. But we managed. Susan nodded, letting the silence stretch. The vague edge to Catherine's response wasn't lost on her. If there's anything else you need, clothes, supplies, please let me know. Thank you, Catherine murmured, her gaze dropping. Susan lingered a moment longer before retreating, leaving Catherine alone once more. Later that day, Gregory joined Ben in the study, where the butler was meticulously organizing the morning's correspondence. You've been quiet, Gregory noted, taking a seat by the window. Ben's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. There's something about her, sir, he said evenly. She avoids direct answers, and her reactions feel calculated. Gregory nodded, the tension from Patterson's call still simmering beneath the surface. "Observe her closely," he whispered. "Something isn't adding up." As the day wore on, Gregory's unease grew. Catherine's story was as worn out as the coach she had arrived in, and with Patterson in the background, each small oddity felt like a fragment of a larger, more sinister puzzle. The morning quiet of the Marlowe mansion shattered with the abrupt, insistent pounding at the front door. Gregory, seated in the study and mid-sentence with Ben, stiffened. Susan, arranging a plate of sliced apples for the twins in the kitchen, froze as the sound echoed through the halls. Ben moved quickly but calmly to the door, his ever unflappable demeanor in place. Yet even he couldn't conceal his surprise when two uniformed police officers greeted him. "Is Mr. Gregory Marlowe home?" the taller of the two asked, his voice clipped. Susan appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. The officer's gaze shifted past her shoulder as Gregory entered the hall, his expression already taut with tension. "I'm Gregory Marlowe," he said. "What's going on?" Before the officer could respond, Catherine appeared at the top of the stairs. Her face was pale but streaked with dramatic tears, her voice trembling as she descended. "You found us," she cried, clutching the banister as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You found me." Gregory's frown deepened. "Catherine, what?" "He's the one," Catherine interrupted, pointing a shaking finger at him. "He took me and my children. He wouldn't let us leave. I was so scared." The words hit Gregory like a blow. For a moment, the sheer audacity of the accusation left him speechless. The officers exchanged looks, their stances subtly shifting. "That's not true," Susan's voice rang out, breaking the stunned silence. She stepped forward, instinctively moving to shield John, who was clutching her leg. "You can't seriously believe—" The officer raised a hand. "Ma'am, we need to take this seriously. Miss Catherine has made a formal accusation of abduction." "That's ridiculous," Gregory said sharply, his shock giving way to anger. "She came here willingly. I found her and the children stranded on the street. I brought them here to help." Catherine's sobs grew louder, almost theatrical. "He's lying. He said he'd help us, but then he locked us in. He took my bag, everything. I had no choice but to stay." John began to cry, and Susan knelt beside him, her arms wrapping protectively around both him and Jack, who had started fussing in his high chair. "Please, stop this," Susan said, her voice breaking slightly. "You're scaring the children." The taller officer stepped forward. "Mr. Marlowe, we'll need you to come with us to the station for questioning. This is a serious matter." "You can't be serious," Gregory snapped. "I've done nothing wrong." "Sir," the officer said firmly, "you have the right to an attorney, and you'll have the chance to give your statement." Susan rose, her face pale but resolute. "Gregory," she said softly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Go with them. We'll figure this out." For a moment, Gregory's gaze locked with hers, the unspoken trust between them anchoring him. He exhaled sharply, nodding once. "Fine, but I'm calling my lawyer the second we get there." The officers led Gregory out, leaving Susan standing in the entryway, her hand clutching the doorframe as if it might steady her. The sound of the front door closing behind them echoed ominously through the house. Ben appeared at her side, his voice calm as ever. "What would you like me to do, Mrs. Marlowe?" Susan turned to him, her jaw tightening. "Stay with the children," she said, glancing towards the kitchen where John and Jack huddled together. "I need to make a call." Minutes later, Susan sat at Gregory's desk in the study, the phone pressed to her ear. "David, it's Susan. I need your help." David Greer's voice, familiar and reassuring, came through the line. "What's going on?" She quickly explained the events of the morning, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. David listened without interruption, his tone grave when he finally spoke. "This doesn't add up, Susan," he said. "If Gregory helped her, why make the accusation now?" "I don't know," Susan admitted. "But Catherine's been strange. She's evasive, and Gregory's been suspicious for days." "Then we start there," David said decisively. "I'll dig into her background. If there's something to find, I'll find it." "Thank you," Susan said quietly. Thank you." Upstairs, Catherine stood in the guest room, pacing. Her sobs had long since ceased, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. She glanced toward the duffel bag in the corner, then at the door. "Everything's falling into place," she murmured to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. But her hands trembled slightly as she moved to the window, peering out at the driveway. She had expected to feel satisfaction watching Gregory's car disappear down the road, but instead, an unfamiliar unease settled in her chest. Downstairs, Susan hung up the phone, her resolve hardening. Whatever Catherine's game was, Susan would find out, and she would stop it. That evening, the mansion exuded an unnatural silence, the kind that only occurs when a storm has started to intensify. Susan sat cross-legged on the floor of the nursery, her hair loose and her movements gentle, as she coaxed John into eating a few bites of dinner. Jack lay in his crib, babbling softly to himself, one chubby fist clutching a worn, stuffed bear Susan had found in the back of a storage closet. "There you go, sweetheart," Susan murmured, holding the spoon steady as John reluctantly opened his mouth. His wide, wary eyes never left hers. "One more taste, and you'll be satisfied. See? Easy." John chewed slowly, his small shoulders still stiff with tension. Susan smiled at him, her patience unyielding despite the weight pressing on her chest. The boy was so young, yet his eyes held a knowledge of fear and uncertainty that no child should ever know. From the hallway, Ben stood watch, his presence steady and unobtrusive. He had spent the afternoon quietly ensuring the household continued to function despite the chaos. His sharp eyes missed nothing, not the fleeting looks Catherine cast toward the door, nor the subtle shift in her demeanor since Gregory had been taken away. "She's planning something," Ben said softly, as Susan rose, placing the empty bowl on the dresser. Susan turned to him, her face pale but resolute. "I know," she replied, her voice low, "but we need to focus on the boys right now. They're what matter." The clock in the hallway struck midnight, its chime echoing faintly through the mansion. The house was still, its inhabitants asleep, or so it seemed. Catherine's door opened with a soft creak, and she stepped into the dim corridor, her bare feet silent against the polished wood floors. In one hand, she clutched her duffel bag, its strap worn and frayed. Her other hand trembled slightly as she balanced a folded piece of paper against it. She moved quickly, her breath shallow, her eyes darting toward every shadow. When she reached the front hall, she paused, glancing back toward the stairs. A faint sound reached her ears, Jack's soft whimper, followed by the gentle hum of Susan's voice, lulling him back to sleep. For a brief moment, something flickered across Catherine's face. Hesitation, regret, or perhaps fear. Then it vanished. She placed the folded letter on the entryway table and slipped out the front door, her figure vanishing into the cold, moonlit night. Susan awoke early the next morning, the pale light of dawn casting long shadows across the nursery walls. She checked on John and Jack first, her heart softening at the sight of them snuggled together in the crib. John protectively draped his small arm over his brother, his face peaceful for the first time in days. A sharp knock at the doorframe startled her. Ben stood there, his expression grave. "She's gone," he said simply. Susan blinked, the words slow to register. "What do you mean?" "Catherine," Ben replied. "Her room is empty. She left during the night." Susan straightened, a chill running through her. "The boys—" "Safe," Ben assured her. "She didn't take them." Relief flooded her momentarily, but it was quickly replaced by sinking dread. "Did she leave anything? A note? Anything?" Ben nodded and handed her the folded paper he'd found in the entryway. Susan unfolded it with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the scrawled words. "Gregory Marlowe. You've taken everything from me. This is all your fault. The truth will find you." Susan felt the cryptic note sink into her stomach like a stone. She handed it back to Ben, her jaw tightening. "We need to tell David. This isn't over." Later that morning, Susan sat in the study, her phone pressed to her ear. David's voice on the other end was calm but serious. "She left the boys?" he asked, his tone tinged with disbelief. "Yes," Susan replied, glancing toward the nursery, where Ben was quietly reading to John. "She left this note, blaming Gregory for something, but it doesn't make any sense. She didn't even try to take the children." David was silent for a moment, then said, "That's strange. If she wanted to hurt Gregory, the boys would be leveraged. Leaving them implies that she may be more interested in running than fighting." Susan nodded slowly, though unease prickled at her. "Can you trace her? Find out where she's gone?" "I'll start digging," David promised. "But Susan, this feels bigger than just Catherine. Be careful." Throughout the day, the mansion felt heavier, its usual calm replaced by a tension that settled deep in Susan's chest. John and Jack, blissfully unaware of the turmoil, played in the sunlit garden under Ben's watchful eye. Susan watched them from the kitchen window, her heart aching as John let out a rare, unguarded laugh at something Jack did. They deserved better than this, better than the lies and manipulation Catherine had brought into their lives. Susan's resolve hardened. Whatever Catherine was running from, and whatever vendetta she harbored against Gregory, Susan would protect these boys. They had already been through too much. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, Susan picked up the phone again. "David," she said when he answered. "Find her. Find out what she's hiding. I won't let her destroy this family." And with that, Susan turned her attention back to the twins, determined to be their anchor in the storm that Catherine had left behind. Gregory stepped out of the police station, the crisp morning air biting at his face. His jaw was tight, and his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets as if to keep his simmering anger contained. The fluorescent lights inside had not alleviated the humiliation of questioning him for a crime he had not committed. The officers had released him due to insufficient evidence, but their skeptical glances lingered, as if they had already decided guilt lived in his tailored suit. "Over here," a familiar voice called. Gregory turned to see David Greer, his old friend and private investigator, leaning casually against his car. His unshaven face and wrinkled jacket belied the sharpness in his eyes. "You look like hell," David remarked as Gregory approached. "Thanks for noticing," Gregory muttered. "Let's get out of here." David nodded, and they climbed into the car. As David started the engine, Gregory stared out the window, his thoughts churning. He felt trapped in a fog of accusations, one that threatened to choke not just him, but everything he'd built. Back at the Marlowe estate, Susan stood in the living room, cradling Jack against her hip. The soft murmur of a news broadcast filtered from the television. John sat on the floor nearby, engrossed in stacking blocks. Ben quietly entered, carrying a fresh pot of tea, but Susan barely noticed. Her heart sank as Catherine's face filled the frame, her focus locked on the screen. The news anchor's voice was calm, but cutting. In a shocking twist, Catherine Stokes, a single mother, accuses Gregory Marlowe, one of San Diego's most prominent businessmen, of abducting her and her children. Catherine, speaking exclusively to this network, shared her harrowing story. The screen cut to Catherine, sitting on a couch with perfectly positioned lighting. Her face was pale, her eyes red from what appeared to be hours of crying. She clutched a tissue in her hand, twisting it dramatically as she spoke. "He promised us help," she said, her voice cracking. "I trusted him. But then, he wouldn't let us leave. He said he'd take care of us. But we were prisoners." Susan's grip on Jack tightened as the boy fussed, sensing her unease. John glanced up, his brows furrowed, though he didn't speak. Ben stood silently at her side, his face carefully neutral. The broadcast continued, Catherine's voice gaining tremulous strength. "He's a powerful man," she said. "I was afraid no one would believe me, but I couldn't stay silent anymore." Susan reached for the remote, her hands trembling as she switched off the television. The silence that followed was deafening. "She's lying," she whispered, though there was no one to argue otherwise. Does the story remind you of a lie that has been troubling you to this day? Why not tell us your story in the comments? I believe you will feel better with some sincere words of comfort. Then we will continue. She glanced at Ben, her eyes pleading for reassurance. "We know that," Ben said evenly. "The question is, how many others will?" David's car pulled into the driveway, just as Susan stepped out of the house. Gregory emerged from the passenger seat, his face drawn, but his eyes sharp. "You've seen it?" he asked Susan, who nodded grimly. "She's everywhere," Susan replied. "The news, blogs, social media, they're eating it up." Gregory's expression hardened, and he stepped past her into the house. Susan followed, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "The twins are fine. They've been playing all morning." "Good," Gregory said, his tone clipped. "Because if Catherine thinks she can use them to ruin me, she's sorely mistaken." David lingered in the doorway, watching the exchange before finally stepping inside. "It's not just her," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Catherine doesn't have the resources to orchestrate a media blitz like this. Someone's backing her." Gregory turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Patterson." "It's a strong possibility," David said, "but I don't have sufficient evidence yet. What I've found so far is interesting." He pulled a folder from his bag and placed it on the kitchen counter. "Catherine's real name is Catherine Stokes, as she claims, but she has a history of questionable associations. She's been tied to 3 different lawsuits in the past, all dismissed quietly. In 2 of those lawsuits, she accused high-profile individuals of misconduct." Susan's eyes widened. "So she's done this before?" "Not exactly like this," David replied, "but close enough to raise red flags." Gregory opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. "She's a grifter," he muttered, "and Patterson's her latest benefactor." David nodded. "It fits. Patterson's been circling for months, looking for a way to knock you out of the game. This," he gestured towards the folder, "could be his opening move." Gregory closed the folder, his jaw tightening. "Then we shut it down. Find proof, and we'll bury them both." Later that evening, Susan sat beside Gregory on the couch, the twins asleep upstairs. She rested a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him as his thoughts raced. "We'll get through this," she said softly. Gregory turned to her, his expression weary but grateful. "They're tearing everything apart," he said quietly. "And the worst part is, I brought it into our home." "You brought her here to help her," Susan replied firmly. "That's not a crime, Gregory, and it's not who you are." Her words settled over him like a balm. He exhaled, leaning back against the couch as the weight of the day pressed down on him. "Whatever happens," Susan said, her voice steady, "we'll protect our family, and we'll fight for the truth." The Marlowe mansion was unusually quiet the following morning, the tension hanging thick in the air. Susan stood at the kitchen counter, methodically preparing breakfast, while her mind raced. John and Jack sat in their high chairs, John fiddling with his spoon, while Jack babbled incoherently, oblivious to the storm swirling around them. "Ben, can you grab the twins' bag from the nursery?" Susan asked, breaking the silence. "There might be something in there they'll want while we're out." Ben nodded and returned moments later with a small, worn duffel bag. As Susan opened it, her brow furrowed. The contents were sparse, a few mismatched clothes, a crumpled picture book, and a small stuffed bear with fraying edges. She picked up the bear, turning it over in her hands. Something on the back caught her attention. "St. Mark's Orphanage," she read aloud, her voice tightening. The bear's fabric featured a neatly embroidered name, almost invisible in its worn state. Ben leaned over, his usually impassive face marked with interest. "That's odd. If the twins are hers, why would their things be from an orphanage?" Susan's stomach dropped as she looked from the bear to John, who was now watching her intently. "They're not her children," she said softly, the realization heavy in her voice. "She's been lying to us from the start." In the study, David spread a series of documents across Gregory's desk, his expression grim. "I tracked her down," he began, gesturing to a photograph of Catherine leaving a nondescript office building. "She's been in contact with Patterson. This confirms she's not working alone." Gregory leaned over the desk, his eyes scanning the papers. "What else do you have?" David pointed to another sheet. "This is where it gets darker. St. Mark's Orphanage is a prestigious institution, well-funded and very selective about its adoption processes. These boys were on their roster less than 3 months ago." Gregory froze. "She took them." David nodded. "The orphanage didn't publicize it, likely to avoid scandal, but I spoke to someone on the inside. It's evident that their abduction was successful." Gregory clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Patterson orchestrated this," he muttered. "He's using these children as pawns to destroy me." David leaned back, his expression cautious. "It's likely, but without solid proof, tying Patterson directly to Catherine's actions. It's just speculation." Gregory straightened, his jaw tightening with resolve. "Then, we'll get proof. Catherine's note, her media stunts, the connection to St. Mark's, they all lead back to him. He wants a war? He'll get one." Later that day, Susan joined Gregory in the study, holding the teddy bear. "This," she said, placing it on the desk, "is our lead." Gregory picked up the bear, his expression softening for a moment before hardening again. "It's disgusting," he said quietly. "Using children, innocent children, for a vendetta." Susan touched his arm gently. "We'll make it right." The phone on Gregory's desk buzzed, and David's voice crackled through the speaker. "You're going to want to see this. Catherine's gone dark, but I've got someone tailing her contacts. There's movement on Patterson's end." "What kind of movement?" Gregory asked sharply. "He's setting up meetings with media executives," David replied. "This isn't over. He's planning another strike." Gregory's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the desk. "Let him try. This time, we'll be ready." That evening, Gregory paced the living room while Susan sat on the couch, watching him with a mix of concern and determination. "You're angry," she said simply. "Of course I'm angry," Gregory shot back, though his tone softened as he met her gaze. "She's taken everything I care about. My name, my reputation, and now we find out she's stolen these boys' lives too." Susan stood and crossed the room, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But you're channeling it into the right place. That's what matters. Gregory sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's just, how far is Patterson willing to go? What's his endgame? Susan shook her head. He's a coward. Cowards tend to exaggerate their actions. We'll find the evidence, and when we do, he won't just lose this battle. He'll lose everything. Her confidence steadied Gregory, and he nodded. We're close. I can feel it. The night stretched long, but Gregory felt the first flicker of hope in days. With David's relentless investigation, the teddy bear's discovery, and the growing trail of evidence, the puzzle was beginning to come together. Gregory was determined to uncover the man hiding behind Patterson's shadow. Upstairs, John and Jack slept soundly, their innocent faces untouched by the chaos unfolding around them. Susan stood in the doorway, watching them with a quiet determination. They deserved a chance at real life, free from manipulation and fear. The morning sun filtered through the nursery window, casting a warm glow over the soft pastel walls. John sat cross-legged on the floor, quietly building a tower of blocks. Nearby, Jack sprawled, babbling to himself while he chewed on a rubber teething toy. Their calm play was deceptive, masking the scars of a turbulent journey neither could articulate. Susan kneeled beside John, her movements slow and deliberate. "That's a tall tower," she said softly, her voice a soothing balm to his small, tense frame. John glanced up at her, his dark eyes cautious but curious. "Big," he murmured, the word tentative as though testing its sound. "That's right," Susan said encouragingly, her smile gentle. "Very big. You're doing a fantastic job." Jack dropped his toy with a clatter, and Susan turned to scoop him up. He squirmed briefly before settling into her arms, his chubby fingers tangling in her hair. "You're a little monkey, aren't you?" she teased, eliciting a giggle. John's gaze lingered on Susan, a flicker of something resembling trust beginning to thaw the wariness in his eyes. He reached for another block, his movements more confident now, and added it to the tower. Downstairs, Gregory sat at the dining table, staring at the pile of documents David had left the previous evening. His hands rested on either side of his coffee cup, the tension in his shoulders evident. Ben entered silently, setting a fresh pot of coffee on the table. "Another late night?" Ben asked, his tone neutral. Gregory nodded, his eyes scanning the papers again. "Patterson is engaging in a strategic maneuver," he remarked. "He's banking on this scandal to make me implode." "Your partners?" Ben asked. Gregory let out a bitter laugh. "The other half are suddenly unavailable." "The other half are suddenly unavailable." Ben didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a small dish of sugar cubes next to Gregory's cup. "The truth has a way of finding its place, sir. And so does loyalty." Gregory met Ben's gaze, finding a flicker of reassurance in the butler's composed demeanor. "Let's hope you're right." Later that morning, Susan rummaged through the twins' bag again, searching for fresh clothes. As she unfolded a tiny sweater, a faint but familiar smell wafted up. Lavender, mixed with something sterile. She paused, pressing the fabric closer to her nose. It reminded her of the scented cleaning products hospitals or institutional facilities often used. Her breath hitched as a memory surfaced. Years ago, she and Gregory had sat in a sterile office, the walls painted in neutral tones, meant to comfort but failing miserably. The doctor's voice was clinical, explaining their infertility options in terms that stripped the conversation of its humanity. She remembered gripping Gregory's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, his quiet strength the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Now, holding the sweater, Susan felt an ache she hadn't revisited in years. The boys upstairs were not theirs by blood, but the connection she felt to them was undeniable. They had come into her life amid chaos, and she would not fail them. David's call came just after noon. Gregory answered on the first ring, his voice sharp. "What do you have?" "I've got a name," David said. "The orphanage's assistant director. He's willing to talk, but only in person." Gregory frowned. "Why the hesitation?" "Because he knows what this will cost him," David replied. "Patterson's reach isn't just deep. It's personal." Gregory exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Set it up. I'll go." "No," David countered. "Not you. If Patterson's watching you, and he is, he'll see it coming. I'll go. You stay put and keep things under control." Gregory didn't argue. He trusted David's instincts, even if they grated against his desire to act. That evening, Susan found Gregory pacing the study, his movements restless. She stepped inside, carrying Jack on her hip and holding John's hand. The boys had refused to sleep without her nearby, and their clinginess only deepened her resolve to protect them. "They wouldn't settle," she said softly, her presence a balm to his frayed nerves. Gregory stopped, his gaze softening as it landed on the boys. "They've been through hell," he said, his voice low. "And they're resilient," Susan replied, setting Jack down on the couch and helping John climb up beside him. "But they need stability. They need us." Gregory sat down, running a hand through his hair. "I keep thinking about what could have happened if we hadn't found them. If they'd stayed with her." Susan placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "We can't change the past, Gregory, but we can make sure their future is better." John reached for Gregory's hand, his tiny fingers curling around two of Gregory's. The gesture was small, but significant, a bridge between the boy's guarded heart and the man who had become his protector. Gregory smiled faintly, his free hand ruffling John's hair. "You're a tough little guy, aren't you?" he said softly. John's lips curved into a tentative smile, and Jack babbled happily beside him, his wide eyes lighting up as he clapped his hands. The air in the Marlowe study was tense, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan doing little to dissipate the weight of the moment. David sat across from Gregory, his laptop open and files spread across the mahogany desk. His usually composed demeanor carried an edge of urgency as he leaned forward, his voice low but insistent. "I met with the assistant director of St. Mark's Orphanage," David began, sliding a folder toward Gregory. He confirmed everything. He confirmed that they had taken the boys months ago, right under their noses. It was methodical, too clean to be a coincidence. Gregory opened the folder, his jaw tightening as he scanned the documents. Photographs of John and Jack stared back at him, their faces innocent and unguarded in a way he hadn't seen since their arrival. David continued, "The director was reluctant to talk at first, but when I showed him what we're dealing with, he gave me this." He tapped a USB drive lying on the table. "Internal correspondence. Patterson had someone on the inside, a staffer who leaked adoption records. That's how Catherine knew about the boys." Gregory's fist clenched. "Patterson orchestrated all of it." David nodded. "He funded Catherine, gave her the story to tell, and sent her to you, knowing you wouldn't turn them away. It's his game to ruin your reputation and make you a business outcast." Gregory exhaled sharply, pushing the folder aside. "This ends now." David raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" Gregory's gaze hardened. "Patterson thinks he's untouchable. If I unexpectedly arrive, he will relax his guard. I'll give him exactly what he wants. A meeting under the guise of reconciliation. While I'm there, I'll get what we need." David's voice dropped to a warning tone. "This is dangerous, Gregory." "If he catches you, he won't," Gregory interrupted. "He's arrogant. He won't see it coming." The next afternoon, Gregory arrived at Patterson's estate. The sprawling mansion loomed behind wrought iron gates, its cold elegance a reflection of the man who owned it. Gregory adjusted his tie and stepped out of the car, his expression carefully composed. The butler led him to the drawing room, where Zachary Patterson stood by a tall window, a glass of scotch in hand. He turned with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Gregory," Patterson greeted, his tone feigning surprise. "I wasn't expecting you." "I thought it was time we talked," Gregory said, offering a thin smile of his own. "We've both been dancing around this for too long." Patterson gestured for him to sit. "I couldn't agree more. Let's see if we can put the past behind us, shall we?" The two men exchanged pleasantries, their conversation peppered with thinly veiled barbs. As Patterson launched into a monologue about the complexities of business partnerships, Gregory subtly reached into his pocket, retrieving a small device no larger than a coin. His movements were deliberate as he placed it beneath the edge of the coffee table, securing it with a soft click. The wiretap was in place. Hours later, back at the Marlowe estate, Gregory sat in his study, the room dimly lit by a single desk lamp. The small recording device lay on the table, connected to David's laptop. After Gregory's departure, they listened in silence as the wiretap recorded every word spoken. At first, there was nothing of note. Patterson pacing, the sound of a glass being set down. Then, a voice broke through the static. "Zachary," Catherine's voice said, sharp and irritated, "you said this would be over by now." "It's working," Patterson replied smoothly. "Gregory's scrambling. The media's eating out of our hands." "But the boys," Catherine pressed, "they're still with him. What if he starts digging into their past?" "Let him," Patterson said, his tone dripping with confidence. "He can't touch me. Everything points to Catherine Stokes, the desperate mother with a heartbreaking tale. You're the face of this, not me." Catherine's voice lowered, her frustration evident. "And when he proves I'm lying," Patterson laughed, "by then it won't matter. His name will be dirt. No one will care about the truth." David paused the recording, his gaze meeting Gregory's. "This is it. It's all here." Gregory leaned back in his chair, his expression grim, but determined. He incriminated himself. That, alone, is sufficient to demolish everything he has constructed. David nodded. "I'll prep this for court. It's ironclad. There's no way he wriggles out of this." Gregory exhaled, the weight of the past few weeks lifting slightly. "Good. Let's ensure that Patterson provides a final explanation for his actions." That evening, Susan found Gregory sitting in the nursery, watching John and Jack as they played on the floor. She approached quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Did it work?" she asked softly. Gregory nodded, his gaze fixed on the boys. "We have everything we need. Patterson's finished." Susan kneeled beside him, her voice full of quiet conviction. "So are we. This family, our family, is stronger than anything he tried to destroy." Gregory reached for her hand, holding it tightly as John toddled over, offering him a block. For the first time in weeks, Gregory felt the stirrings of hope, not just for his reputation, but for the future of the family they were building, one piece at a time. At noon, the Marlowe estate bustled with activity as the press conference got underway. Susan adjusted John's collar as he fidgeted in his seat, while Jack clung to Ben, happily chewing on a stuffed giraffe. Gregory stood by the window, staring out at the reporters gathering in the garden, their cameras glinting under the sun. David entered the room, carrying a slim briefcase. "It's all here," he said, placing it on the desk. "The recording, the documents from St. Mark's, and the timeline we've constructed are all present. Once this goes public, there's no coming back, for Patterson or Catherine." Gregory turned, his jaw set. "Good. It's time the world sees the truth." The garden was filled with the murmur of reporters and the hum of equipment as the family stepped onto the makeshift stage. Gregory stood tall, his tailored suit immaculate, despite the weight of the past few weeks. Susan was by his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Behind them, Ben held the twins, who looked curiously at the crowd. Gregory stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. The crowd quieted, the air thick with anticipation. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "For weeks, my family and I have been the targets of a calculated campaign to destroy our reputation. They have spread lies and fabricated accusations, leaving innocent children in the crossfire. Today, we present the truth." He gestured to David, who placed a laptop on the podium and connected it to the speakers. Patterson and Catherine's crisp, damning voices filled the room. The reporters leaned forward, their pens flying as the conversation unfolded. "Let him," Patterson's voice sneered. "He can't touch me. Everything points to Catherine Stokes, the desperate mother with a heartbreaking tale. You're the face of this, not me." By the time the recording ended, the crowd erupted in murmurs, cameras flashing as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Gregory raised a hand, silencing the chaos. He turned to John and Jack and said, "We took these children from a reputable orphanage and used them as pawns in a cruel scheme. We must ensure they receive the safety and love they deserve, as they have endured enough suffering." Susan stepped forward, her voice clear and warm. "We didn't ask for this, but we won't back down. This is our family, and we will fight to protect it." Within hours, the story dominated the news cycle. Headlines shifted from sensational accusations to exposés of Patterson's manipulation and Catherine's involvement. Public opinion swung sharply in Gregory's favor, with many praising his resilience and kindness in taking in the twins, despite the betrayal. The Marlowe estate was calmer, despite the ongoing battle. Gregory sat in the living room, Jack asleep on his chest, while John played with blocks at his feet. Susan entered, holding her phone. "It's everywhere," she said, sitting beside him. "The media, blogs, even Patterson's own partners are condemning him. He's losing everything." Gregory exhaled, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good. Let him feel what it's like to have everything crumble." "And Catherine?" Susan asked. David entered the room, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "She's no longer there," he declared. He said, "The authorities have issued a warrant, but she has disappeared. Her reappearance is imminent. Someone like her doesn't stay quiet for long." Gregory nodded, his hand resting protectively on Jack's back. "She will take responsibility for her actions." That evening, the Marlowe family gathered in the nursery. The room was filled with the soft breaths of John and Jack as they tucked themselves into their cribs. Susan sat in the rocking chair, her hand in Gregory's, as they watched the boys sleep. "We're finally free of it," Susan said quietly. Gregory nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at his wife. "They tried to destroy us, but all they did was make us stronger." Susan smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And now we have everything we need. A family." As the night deepened, the Marlowe household settled into a peace it hadn't known in weeks. For the first time, they could look forward, not with fear, but with hope for the life they were building together. The courthouse steps gleamed under the midday sun as Gregory and Susan emerged, holding hands. Their lawyer followed closely behind, a stack of signed papers clutched in his arms. The moment felt surreal, heavy with the weight of everything they'd endured, yet lightened by the promise of a fresh start. John toddled ahead, his small legs unsteady but eager. Jack was in Ben's arms, his chubby hands clutching the butler's tie, gurgling with delight. Susan crouched to steady John as he reached for her, his shy smile breaking into laughter as she lifted him into her arms. "They're ours now," Susan whispered, her voice catching. She turned to Gregory, her eyes shining. "Legally, officially, ours." Gregory reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "They've been ours in every way that matters," he said quietly. "This just makes it unshakable." Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was jubilant. The staff, ever loyal, had decorated the dining room with soft white balloons and a banner that read, "Welcome home, John and Jack." The twins' giggles filled the air as Susan guided them through the room, showing them the little details made just for them. Gregory watched from the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Ben approached, holding a small glass of champagne. "A toast, sir?" the butler asked, his voice warm with pride. "To new beginnings," Gregory said, clinking his glass against Ben's. "And to the people who stood by us." Ben inclined his head. "It's been an honor, sir. They're lucky to have you." "No," Gregory replied, watching as Susan lifted Jack into her arms, his laughter filling the room. "We're lucky to have them." Later that evening, as the twins played in the garden under Susan's watchful eye, Gregory and David sat in the study, reviewing the final fallout of their battle with Patterson. "The court has issued a formal investigation into Patterson's business dealings," David said, his voice steady. "His partnerships are crumbling, and his investors are fleeing. He'll be lucky to avoid prison." "And Catherine?" Gregory inquired in a cool, yet curious tone. David shook his head. "Still missing, but the authorities are on her trail. She can't hide forever." Gregory exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "Good. It's time they face the consequences." David leaned back in his chair, studying his friend. "You know, most people wouldn't have handled this the way you did. You could have gone after them with vengeance, but you focused on protecting your family." Gregory met his gaze, his expression resolute. "It's because they hold the key to everything." All of this, he gestured to the files, the laptop, the remnants of their battle, means nothing without them. As the night fell, the Marlowe family gathered in the nursery, the soft glow of a lamp casting a warm light over the room. Susan had John curled up in her lap, his head resting against her shoulder as she read to him. Jack lay in his crib, his tiny fists clutching a blanket, his eyelids heavy with sleep. Gregory stood by the door, taking in the scene. He thought back to the chaos of the past few months, the lies, the betrayals, the fight to protect his family. It had tested him in ways he hadn't thought possible, but it had also revealed what truly mattered. He walked over to Susan, placing a hand on her shoulder. She looked up, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. "They're going to be okay," she said softly. "We're all going to be okay," Gregory replied, his voice steady. "This is where it starts, our real beginning." Susan smiled, leaning into his touch as John's breathing slowed, his small body relaxing in her arms. Gregory reached down, brushing his fingers through his son's hair. His son. The word felt new, but right, like it had been waiting for this moment to take root. Outside, the night was calm, the stars scattered across a clear sky. The Marlowe mansion, once a symbol of cold, calculated success, now felt alive with love and warmth. Inside, laughter and light filled the halls, echoing with the promise of a future built on resilience and hope. As Gregory stood by the nursery window, watching his family settle into the quiet of the evening, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The ordeal had cost him much, but had also given him everything he hadn't realized he needed. Success was no longer defined by boardroom Zacharies or headlines. Success was defined here, in this house, in the small hands that reached for his, and in the shared smiles of the woman who had stood by him through it all. For the first time in a long time, Gregory looked forward, not with trepidation, but with the certainty that love, laughter, and family would guide every step ahead. If this film touches your heart, Leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.